Hi, so this is Sam, and I did my presentation on the prison reformation movement and the organizations that work alongside. So we'll start out with just some facts. So $81 billion is actually spent on mass incarceration every year. And right here, we just have a breakdown of some of that. So here's the $81 billion I was talking about, breaking down. But that doesn't take into account the judicial and the legal money, and obviously the policing. And then down here is kind of important, but also kind of forgotten about, but it's the cost to the families, the commissary, and the telephone calls, which is actually quite a lot. So today, there are actually 2.2 million people behind bars, which is an increase of about 1.9 million since around 1972. And this is obviously a graph of everything inside of that. But I think the most significant part for us right now, or at least for later, is going to be this part for the not convicted. So around 465,000 people sit in local jails out of obviously the 615,000 not convicted, um, which is, I think, completely bizarre. And then also 75% of prisoners go back to prison within the first 5 years. And then this is obviously just some of the reasoning on or what they went back for. I'm not surprised really to see that drug is the highest of people that go back, and we will also talk more about that later. So what is the problem? In my opinion, I think it's really that there's not enough effort put into the reintegration and rehabilitation of ex-cons. So obviously, this means trying to get jobs readily available for cons to inhabit when they get out of jail. Because obviously, if we have less people in jail, we would spend less money on jail. And honestly, in the long run, and it doesn't matter who saves money at this point. It can be the government, it can be the individual corporations that run some of the jails. It doesn't matter as long as across the board we start to have a decrease in people that are incarcerated, because the amount of people that we have in jail is incredibly large. So what do we need in order for this to happen? Or at least what can help aid it? So we need a change to the care of the inmates, physically and psychologically, and also a change in the rehabilitation of the inmates after being released, and also a change in the policies that deal with a community safety, which honestly will reduce the prison population in turn, because you would be controlling the amount of people that would be sent to the prisons. But yeah, so, and at any point you can pause the video and look at any of the little details. Obviously, I know it's a lot. So the first organization we're going to talk about is the Prison Fellowship, which obviously is openly Christian, but they're not really partial really about any of their goals on their website. And these were actually taken straight from their site. So they give opportunities for visitors to just go ahead and take action, and try and in the persuasion of political officials on getting stuff done. And I think the most significant one here is that education programs have actually resulted in 43% lower recidivism, which is actually people coming back to prison. And so that's what the Prison Fellowship, or one of the things that they advocate for, is for people to push for the Pell Grant access to be access to people behind bars so that they can get an education. So it's not really about what they want to do. It's about what they can do, because there are huge amounts of limits for movements to be able to accomplish given the law and everything else. So they're specifically calling for citizens to push lawmakers into making certain policy proposals. For example, the restoration of Pell Grant. which is great because it gives the convicts tools to work with for returning to civilian life. It provides a better direction to take other than the direction that they were taking when they were being arrested. Like we were talking about with the drugs. We had so many of them coming back within the first 3 years just because of drugs. And honestly, it's probably because the root of the problem. And honestly, obviously, none of this is enough. But the root of the problem is that employers won't hire convicts if they see felon on their application. And I think that the number one thing we need to work on to help improve everything else is abolishing the stigmatism against having an ex-convict on your application. So what else can some of the movements do? But one of them is promote education programs within jails. This helps them kind of be more productive in an otherwise secluded or alienating environment, because a lot of the effects that it has on them really are some negative psychological ones. Yeah, so this is the Inside Circle, and they apply only really to Folsom Prison, which is a specific prison. But they have formed a bunch of support group circles, and they have a really pretty wide network at this point, despite the fact that they're only coming out of one specific jail. But they help aid with the trauma and deal with the responsibility of their actions, the convicts, that is. And they go through this whole rehabilitation process, and they actually become integrated into the program itself. And they start becoming advocates to newer, obviously, convicts that get involved with the program. But they offer peer mentorship, education, facilitation training, and service opportunities, which is really cool. Then we have the SPLC, which they are specifically a law center. So they deal with a lot of issues other than obviously anything to do with the prison. But they specifically advocate for inhumane conditions for prisoners. So they make sure that people are receiving their proper medical and mental health care. But they utilize litigation, education, and other forms of advocacy for that and all kinds of other issues. Obviously, they're a law firm, so that's exactly how they would go. And so now kind of on the subject of the conditions of prisons, I have a video.
Can you tell just by looking at me that I am a felon? For most of you, the answer is no, because you're only relying on what you can see with your eyes. But behind what we can visually see is a story. In 2011, my best friend overdosed on heroin and died in my father's basement. About 7 months later, I was arrested in connection with his death because I was a passenger in the vehicle when he purchased the drugs. I spent about 4 months in county jail awaiting a bond reduction hearing, and during that time, I witnessed many injustices. We were locked down for days because of understaffing. Dental care amounted to the pulling of teeth, and many of the women that I was incarcerated with had been in jail for almost a year because their public defender just couldn't devote enough time to their case. It was these injustices, along with what occurred in the courtroom during my case, that solidified my commitment to American prison reform. I started to research prison systems, and over time, I realized that not all countries follow the same model. I just returned from field research in Norway and Finland, where I had the pleasure of touring some of their prisons, which, by the way, I never thought would come out of my mouth. But what I learned opened both my mind and my eyes to a multitude of possibilities. There are two big differences between the Nordic system and the American way of doing things, and those are the principle of normality and the role of the prison guard. So we'll start with the principle of normality. Since most inmates are going to be re-entering society at some point in time, they set the prisons up to be as much like the outside world as humanly possible. Behind me, Halden Maximum Security Prison, they don't have any bars on their doors. Each living unit has a common living space and a kitchen, and each of the rooms, or cells, looks more like a dorm room with its own window, a desk, and its own bathroom. Also, each of the inmates retains the civil rights that they entered with, and these civil rights include the right to education, health care, and voting. Secondly, the role of the prison guard. In Norway, a prison guard is called a contact officer, and each contact officer is assigned 2 to 3 inmates that they are personally responsible for, kind of like a social worker. But Jenny, how do they dispel violence, you may ask? Well, they do it through prevention. And how do they do that? Well, they do it through communication. Yes, you heard me correctly. They actually talk to the inmates as if they're human beings. Novel concept, don't you think? When you have a close relationship with another person, you can tell when their emotions are running a little high, or if they maybe just need to chill out for a little bit. You can talk to them before anything explosive happens. Interestingly, Halden Maximum Security Prison does have a restraint bed, but in the 8 years this prison has been in operation, they haven't had to use it one time, all because of communication. It is time for us to open our eyes to the fact that we have to reform our prison systems. It is completely unacceptable for a country as well-developed and supposedly progressive as the United States of America to have a prison system that is so grossly abusive and ineffective. As long as we continue our punitive approach to prison, we will continue to churn out toxicity. It is just as simple as that. It's time for a change. It's time for us to come to our senses. Thank you.
So obviously we could connect that back to when we were talking about some of the inhumane conditions that jails can go through. Obviously this was talking about some of the great conditions that a prison can be, but still. And then also we would like to connect this back to the beginning when I was talking about that huge portion of people that were just chilling in jail without a conviction. That number was 465,000 people in local jails are not convicted. When she was talking about that, just literally in for 4 months was in jail. But yeah, so and then we have the United Nations, which they mostly discuss about the underlying physical health issues that they worsen with longer time in jail, obviously. But the same thing applies kind of for mental issues. But they're a great source of information regarding on why we should promote prison reformations, and they have a lot of the benchmarks for action in prison reformations, which is essentially their standards. But the United Nations still doesn't have any real power. They can inspire citizens to take initiative, and they can inform publics on what they should be expecting out of, for example, their prison system. But that's really all that they can do. So the breakdown here, if we go back to when we were talking about the prison fellowship, so they essentially were just like doing law proposals to government officials and encouraging citizens to even do it. So this is obviously a very vertical direction when we're talking about the types of different movements, because we obviously had, for example, the Pell Grant, which is an already established but it is an established thing. So they're working within the system. And is it really democratic? I don't really think so, because they are playing so tightly in the system. I don't think there really is a lot of input coming from different people. I think it's probably a hierarchical situation of a few people make the decisions and everyone else follows suit. But the pros is that I guess if you hound on one proposal of a policy and you get enough support, then you might eventually get success with it. But the cons are obviously, when I said it's very limited, I feel like it would be very single-minded with how everything would work. And like I said, it might eventually work, but for all we know, it might not ever. And then we were talking about the Inside Circle, um, which is when they were implementing the education programs. So I would call this more a horizontal approach because although it was very narrow, they didn't really wait on the system to do anything. They took actions into their own hands. And I don't know if this was a privately owned prison, and that's why they're able to have so much hands on interactions with the inmates, or what really, how that really worked. But that is kind of, I think, why they're able to do it. But is it democratic? I think yes, definitely, because you're having not only outside people mm, that are driving it and pushing it forward, but you also have the reintegration of the convicts when they get out of prison back into the program and keeping it alive. Um, so yeah, and then some pros of that is it's highly effective. Like it has impacted the inmates that have graduated, as they put it, from the program. But the cons of it is it only works really on small scale. It's very personable, so it probably only will work on small scale. And they never really reach outside of that one Folsom prison. And then we talked about the SPLC, which was specifically the law center. So obviously, this is a vertical approach because they utilize the litigation aspect, and they call for the legal action for inhumane prisoner conditions. And is it democratic? I would say yes, mostly because it's driven by the client and the people that they're fighting for. Um, I don't know how much obviously the individual lawyers would have a say on anything, but I would assume pretty democratic. And some of the pros of this uh, movement aspect, I guess, would be they give very specific informed aid to those who might not already have it. But some of the cons to that is that it's very limited in its ability because you probably have only so many lawyers under that umbrella of an agency. And they're obviously limited by the court system. So, if there's something screwy going on at the top, obviously, then lawyers here at the bottom won't have much of effect on anything. And yeah, so if you have any questions, you can email me or you can comment on this video. I don't exactly know how that works, but I hope you aren't too bored, and I hope you guys are staying safe. Bye.